Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. In this episode, I'm very pleased and privileged to have had Peggy O'Donnell Heffington on the podcast. Peggy is an Assistant Instructional Professor in the Department of History at the University of Chicago. Her background is in history. There, she teaches historical research and writing methods, and also gender and women's history. She is the author of her first book, Without Children, The Long History of Not Being a Mother, which is what we talk about in this conversation. We start the conversation by kind of just generally asking, why is it that some women do not have children, and what are some of the reasons for that? We talk about millennials and younger people generally having children later, and some of the impact that many structural aspects of our society have for the idea of choice. We talk about various complicated factors of choice, especially between career and family. We spend a good amount of the conversation talking about the history of abortion and contraception laws. We talk about the role of Anthony Comstock. We talk about contraceptives, Roe v. Wade, Dobbs. We talk about the history and origins of the nuclear family, the grandmother hypothesis, public perceptions of people without children, and many other topics. I absolutely loved Peggy's book. I think it's an absolutely important moment to have this type of conversation as people are changing their ideas about gender norms, as they're changing their ideas about family, as they're changing their ideas about many things, as we're moving through the 21st century. I think it's good to have these types of conversations in really honest and balanced ways, which Peggy does in her book, which she does in the conversation. She's absolutely brilliant. She's very lovely. And it was such a blast to talk to her for a full 2 hours. I was very, very thankful that she gave so much of her time and energy, and to be honest, I probably could have gone at least another hour. We definitely covered so many things, and she was just a real joy to talk to, and really, really wonderful to read her book. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. It's also on YouTube. So subscribe and share with everyone you know. And now I bring you Peggy O'Donnell Heffington. I'm here with Peggy O'Donnell Heffington. Peggy, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm very much looking forward to talking with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. You have written your first book, which is called Without Children, The Long History of Not Being a Mother. It's a great subtitle, by the way. And
Thank you.
It's a great book. I really, really enjoyed it. And we'll talk all about it. But before we do, just tell listeners kind of the snapshot of who you are. So what your background is in, what you study, what you currently do, and how you came to write the book.
Sure, yeah. So I am a professor of history at the University of Chicago. The book is a complete departure from my doctoral work. I was trained as a European historian, and I worked on human rights history. The history of exhuming mass graves, it actually was what my dissertation was about. And I found that to be a really important topic, but it wasn't something I was deeply passionate about. And so when I left graduate school and I started teaching, I initially returned to the dissertation to say, because we're supposed to write books as historians, like, how do I turn this into a book? Mm-hmm. And I realized that I had sort of no interest in pursuing that anymore. So then I'm casting about for a book topic. And I realized that having children and not having children was something that I talked about constantly with my peers. It was something that I cared about. And I decided to sort of pursue, a book-length history of the same subject that sort of got me out of bed in the morning. And so this book was really, it was a departure from my original sort of interests as a historian. And it was a way of connecting my sort of personal interests with my historical work.
So is it fair to say it's a passion project? It's something that you feel passionate about. It's something that you really enjoy. And obviously you can use your skill set as a historian as a kind of lens over it as well. it's definitely something that you feel passionate about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I I started conceiving of this book when I guess I was in my early 30s. I was watching, my peers either have children, sort of decide to not have children, grapple with the decision of whether or not to have children or whether or not children could even fit into their lives. Um, and that got the historian part of my brain thinking of, like, are these new questions? Is this a new experience? And I think one of the delightful things about history is that basically nothing is new. You can do a history of anything. And so yeah, I mean, I think it was a project that grew out of my own personal experience, trying to sort of contextualize things that I and the people around me were going through.
Mm, yeah, no, I think that yeah, that makes a lot of sense to try and figure out, well, where's this coming from, or what's the kind of origins with this. So I guess there's this idea of, I mean, really, I guess your book is kind of about motherhood, but in terms of in a different approach of why people are not. And in the book, it's cool how you organize the chapters. I'm sure this was intentional, but you start the introduction by saying that we're not having children. And then you give, each chapter is because of this reason, this reason, this reason. So it's 6 chapters, and then the conclusion, which I thought was really clever. So I guess for you, what's the kind of central thesis you're trying to get out in the book? What is it that you want to really kind of drive home as your central thesis?
So there's two ideas, I think, at the core of the book, and they're a little bit in tension, or they seem to be a little bit in tension at first glance, but I think that they're actually connected. One is that there have always been women without children. There have always been a variety of reasons people haven't had children. That sounds super simple, but I think it actually was something that I really felt like needed to be established. When you listen to politicians in the media, they tend to frame not having children as this thing that millennials invented, that it's like another thing that millennials have broken, or another way that they're shirking their duties or being selfish, or I had a number of interactions sort of early on in writing the book with, people I think who would very much identify themselves as being supportive of reproductive rights and choice and all of this, who looked at me and they said, how could you possibly write a long history of not having children? Like, wasn't birth control invented in the 1950s? Like, who are you writing about? And so I really felt like I needed to establish, no, people were making very deliberate decisions about their reproductive lives and whether they were going to parent or not for a very, very long time. And that, as the book's organization shows, that many of the reasons they would have had actually very much mirror reasons that women today cite when they say they're not having children. So that's one piece, like that this is not a new thing. On the other hand, I wanted to sort of suggest that, that this is something that is becoming increasingly common. And that is, I think, in large part because of the way we've constructed our modern society and our lives, that makes all of the reasons that women have not been having children for a very long time, it sort of intensifies those reasons and makes more people think harder before they have children.
hmm hmm Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I recently had Jean Twanging on the podcast, and we talked obviously about generations. That's her work. And, she looks at the data points over the 6 generations in our society, and kind of these fast and slow kind of life cycles that people have. And obviously, millennials are we're now at least myself, I as a either a middle or older millennial, we're all getting into our 40s now. We're in our early, late 30s, early 40s, and we're all figuring out this kind of thing about family. And so obviously, but it's not only millennials. Millennials certainly have got married later, if at all. They have kids later, if at all. Um, but other generations have done some variant of this. So obviously, older generations were having children much earlier in life, but not every generation. And so it's interesting to see the kind of ebbs and flows here. So obviously, you mentioned in the book, and as I'm bringing it up here, this idea about millennials. And so, Well, I guess what's your kind of take on the current generation? So obviously, Gen Z is, between the ages of, what is it, 11 or 12 to 26, 27, whatever that is. So I
Mhm.
guess we're seeing that with them too. But I guess millennials are the kind of the biggest cohort that's of, childbearing age of sorts, if you will. Um, so is it not just because of individual choices of why millennials aren't having kids, but also structural ones such as policies and laws and things like that? What's your kind of, I guess, take on the millennium cohort where they're saying, "Hey, listen, we're gonna just wait, or not have it at all, or we're not gonna have six kids, we're gonna have one kid maybe." What's your kind of points that you're trying to drive home on millennials?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can tell an anecdote to sort of illustrate. So I I really started thinking about this book in earnest when I had just finished my PhD at Berkeley, and I moved to take a postdoctoral fellowship at West Point at the Military Academy in New York. And so I left Berkeley, California, where I was surrounded by other graduate students who were all making like 20 grand a year in Berkeley, who could sort of barely feed ourselves, let alone think about creating more humans. But also sort of a milieu of like, Silicon Valley and tech workers. And, no one I knew was really thinking about having children. Either it was sort of a ridiculous economic proposition, or it was just sort of not the priority. And then I find myself landing at West Point, and I'm surrounded by Army officers, who were largely men, and their wives, who were sort of the women of my age that I found myself interacting with. And they all had three children. I mean, it was really remarkable. I had a woman who had the postdoc before me had told me on the phone, she'd warned me, like, your uterus has never felt so barren as it will when you land at West Point. Um, and of course, there's the cultural component there, right? Like, they lived in a culture where having children at a relatively young age was quite normal.
Mm-hmm.
But I also came to understand that there were all kinds of policies and structures around their lives that made it possible, that sort of facilitated having lots of children. There's subsidized daycare, there's free healthcare, there's subsidized housing, like multi-bedroom housing for officers' families. There's there's sort of genuinely inspiring community efforts to support each other. And so, I don't want to discount, of course, military life carries a lot of risk. My husband is a retired Army officer. I certainly wouldn't want to discount that. But in a lot of ways, the military created circumstances under which it was quite possible to have large families. And then so conversely, that made me think about, like, okay, well, people living in a context where daycare is incredibly expensive, where, housing is incredibly expensive, where you move a lot, but there's no sort of, social infrastructure to welcome you and support you in a new place. But, where it is quite difficult to have a lot of children, or maybe any children at all.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, it sounds like you're talking about like the infrastructure. Maybe let me push this a little bit further, and you can tell me if I'm misrepresenting you. So the claim maybe here could be, if there's an infrastructure or a type of structure where those needs are met. So let's just say daycare and or childcare, healthcare, maybe something that was, maybe let's not say subsidized housing, but housing that was maybe more affordable. You're can I push that claim to say we probably would see people having more kids if there was a better infrastructure, kind of, writ large, the nation as a whole? Would you push it that far, or will we still see this kind of hesitancy by people to say, yeah, that's all great, but I still don't want to have kids? What do you think?
Well, I think this is the typical historian move. Like, well, it's complicated.
It's
So
fine.
I
It's
think
totally fine. I'm so used to that answer on this podcast at this point.
you clearly are around academics a lot. That's my joke with my students, is that the answer to everything is like, well, it's
It's
complicated.
a great
So
answer. I like that answer. It's just,
so on the one hand, I do think there are studies and scholarship that suggests that the women's access to education and contraception just sort of encourages people to have smaller families, that people opt in to having smaller families when women have other options and they have access to contraception. So it may be that there is some, that it's not solely a failure of modern society, but actually some of its successes that are allowing people to limit the size of their family.
Mm.
On the other hand, though, there are numbers that suggest that precisely what you were proposing is true, that if there were sort of structures or policies or laws or support systems that helped families, that people would have more children. Primarily, I'm thinking about, so in the United States today, the fertility rate, which is the number of births any woman will have in her lifetime, the average number is 1.7. And when surveys ask American women how many children they want, the average is 3. So American women are having significantly fewer children than they say they want. And so I think in that gap, you can probably see that there is some element of, people stopping at 1 or 2 because it's freaking expensive, or because their lives are too complicated, or they live too far from family. When under ideal situations, the size of the family that they want is 3. And so in that gap, I think there is opportunity to sort of better support families so that people aren't, I'm all for people who want to limit births, but I don't think it's great that people who want more children don't feel like they can have them.
Yeah. Say that was a great answer. See, like, it's complicated, but that's how most of life is. It's complicated, right?
Yeah.
That's what history teaches us. Like, humans and life is complicated. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, I want to come back to some of those factors a bit,
Yeah.
but I guess the question here, let's talk about just real quick about this idea of choice. I know many people personally that are a little bit younger than me, so maybe younger millennials, and even people now that are older than me that are at least kind of in a way where they can carry a child. They're just kind of aging out, if you will. They're not physically able to. Of course, you can have adoption and things like that as well. But so in this kind of range, a lot of people that I know personally, and in my clinical work, and the clients I see and things like that, I hear this often of this idea of choice. Well, I don't. So we can talk about the inverse of that, of what you're saying with contraception is giving these people. There's an inverse of that, but a lot of people would say, I just don't want to have kids. I don't want to have kids where I'm carrying the child, or even to adopt or other methods, surrogacy, things like that. So how, I think for you might have numbers behind this. I don't have numbers, but I think I would suspect that there's a sizable portion of women saying, yeah, I don't want to have children, because then my career is going to have to take a backseat. So, you know, if I'm somebody that, as a woman, there's many advancements that have been made in the 20th century, and still going 21st century for, many women are doctors now and are lawyers and, engineers and all these things. And that's all great. So there's, amazing, net positives for our economy and our society for those things. So that's wonderful. But a lot of the times these, women will say, yeah, but I can't be committed to a pretty demanding career. So let's take law, for example. You do the whole thing, you work your way up, you get to like 29, 30, you're on your way to partner, or you're working in the government or something, you're doing really well and you're moving all the way up. You have to factor in, well, when am I going to sit down and have kids? And I got to take time. And of course there's, I think, still discrimination for women that
Yeah.
they tell their employer they're pregnant or whatever, and you see a lot of those women get laid off or fired or lose their jobs, which I think is grotesque. But um, you know, but so this idea of I think a lot of women. I mean, I'm not speaking for women. This is what I've been told
Yeah.
numerous times is there's this feeling of choice of career or quote unquote family. We can have a separate conversation about this about, well, how do we uh, reimagine what family looks like in the 21st century? So that's a kind of already a follow up. But I guess what do you make of this idea of choice, namely between a woman feeling like they have to choose between a career of sorts within a capitalist society and having one kid, much less two or three kids? What do you make of this?
Yeah. So when surveys ask people who don't have children sort of why they don't have children, well, or to sort of identify themselves, I guess, about 5% of Americans will say that they are voluntarily childless, which I interpret. I mean, of course, there's gray area, but I interpret that to mean, I just didn't want kids. I chose not to have children.
So they could be very affluent, have all the money in the world, all the the community resource, all the resources. Let's say they just don't want to have kids.
They just don't want to have kids. Okay. And then about 5 or 6%, the CDC estimates are experiencing infertility, that they are involuntarily childless, for lack of a better word. Mm-hmm. For millennials, of course, as you mentioned, our fertile years are not yet done, but it's sort of looking like millennials will be somewhere between 20 and 25% will have no children. And so that means that the majority, or half, say, of people without children fall somewhere between voluntarily and involuntarily childless. And I think that gray area in between sort of complicates the idea of choice. Like, choice is great. It was an animating principle of progressive politics and the reproductive rights movement and feminism, at least for half a century. Yeah. However, choice also sort of implies both an agency to make choices, and it doesn't really give a lot of room for the context in which the choice is made. It sort of implies that, like, you've got a whole variety of choices and you just choose whichever one you want to choose. In 1994, a group of Black feminists and thinkers and theorists called the Sister Song Collective came up with the idea of what they called reproductive justice, which they offered as an alternative to choice for precisely that reason, that they wanted to say, choice is all well and good, but we also need to look at the context a person is making the choice in, and the context in which they will have to raise their child. And so then it's not just like abortion and contraception that are choice issues. It's lots of things. It's the minimum wage. It's environmental racism. It is income inequality. And at the other end of the income spectrum, it's those factors that you laid out. It's that, professional women take a lifelong pay hit if they have children. There have been economists have shown that the much of the wage gap between professional women and professional men can be explained by motherhood. That women who don't have children effectively have no wage gap between them and men. And so there are these other factors that sort of like play into this idea of choice. I think the idea of choice makes it seem much cleaner than it actually feels to a lot of people. That on the one hand, you have people who are, thinking about, do I want to have children, or do I want to potentially be, economically mobile? Do I want to be able to sort of like save and buy a house? Or go to graduate school and be able to get a better job, or and then on the other hand, you have, do I want to sort of reach the absolute heights in my career, or do I want to sort of have to step back for 5 years, or even if I don't step back, my employer is going to, penalize me in all kinds of really subtle ways for being a woman with children.
Mm-hmm.
And so I mean, again, I think it's complicated.
Mm-hmm.
There's both. Well, yeah, I'll leave it there. Maybe you have a follow-up.
No, I like the way you said it. I think this idea of choice kind of makes it very sanitized, but it's really more, complex. And so some of these, we can just talk a little bit about some of the things you mentioned there is these
Sure.
contributing factors, which are, so, income or wealth inequality. So, or lack of money or funds. Social supports are huge. If your family's living all over the place and you only have like maybe an aunt that lives an hour away, that's very hard to raise one, and if not more, children. Partners, flexible work schedules, etc.
Yeah.
So I think about, maybe for listeners, they'll have this idea in their mind, either for themselves or people they know, that, this idea that if you were to ask people, and specifically women, but if you were to ask people, why don't you want to have kids? Right. Let's say they say, so let's say it's like, yeah, I'm open to the idea. It's not that I have this aversion to having kids, but it's more of, what sacrifices do I have to make? Not even for career or for jobs, but also for kids are expensive. They're very fucking expensive. And
this from personal experience.
I know this from personal experience. My daughter's lovely, but it's just, kids are expensive. And then it's also, so it's a monetary thing. And that's a big concern, I think, because it's like, if I can't support myself, or I feel like I can't support myself or my partner or whatever, then we have to very much 100%, a kid can't go and just get a job and just like kind of contribute. Like, that's, so I think a lot of the times it's economic. I think maybe we'll get into the history in a bit, but I think the contraceptives thing is interesting. I think it's a great thing, but I think there's some, as we're seeing, there's some negatives. I think all contraceptives have, especially for women, and the role it plays in their health, I think has potential side effects, negative side effects. I think it's a great thing in general of people having choice and autonomy to decide if they do or they don't. But I think that might have been different in 1945, right? Or 1950, where it's like, well, we didn't really have that. So it was like, well, if you have an unplanned pregnancy, it's like, okay. And if you still have a kind of, the country is still kind of Puritan, and it's like, and then abortion wasn't legal, there's not much you could really do, right? So I wonder how many people have, been unplanned, if you will. And what that would look like if the things we have now were in place, 100 years ago. I mean, it's a thought experiment, I guess. But so all of these things, and then, but I guess the big thing is about this thing about like I'll say family, but I guess really is like community/family is like, I mean, it kind of does take a village to raise a kid. I mean, it's you could have two loving, endearing, invested parents from day one. But they need a break. It's very difficult. If one or both are working, it's very difficult. And so I wonder, you usually rely on, grandparents, maybe, a nephew or a niece or a cousin or something like that. And so I think that when I've talked to certain people and they say, well, I don't think I'll be able to do it financially. I don't know what's going to happen with my career. I don't have any family that lives nearby, or I'm not close with my family, or they wouldn't do that, or they're, not able to for various reasons. I think it just is a list that starts piling up. So it's like, yeah, in theory, I'd like kids, but I also want to be a responsible adult. And that just feels potentially irresponsible or extremely high risk. And again, just in a context, this, back, let's say 100 years ago, well, it was like, well, you just deal with it and you figure it out. And like, that's hard. But I think if you gave people more options, it might be different. So I think there's an interesting thing with various contraceptive methods, which again, I think is a net positive. But it's interesting how we're having these conversations now, and we didn't have these in 1930, right? It's just interesting, or at least, let me correct, not in the same way, I should say. So, I think what is it, I guess, about all of those factors and those elements, and maybe other things I haven't mentioned that are kind of getting loaded into this idea of how complicated this idea of choice or a person's decision is to not have or children?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things you're getting at is that it is great that people today, women today in particular, feel like they have more choices about how they want to live their life. Like, do they want to be a CEO, or do they want to be a astronaut, or do they want to, live in the woods on a commune, or do they want to, have children, and and that is a great thing. But I also do think that, the more choices we have, the more choices we leave behind, right? Like
Yeah.
the more options expand.
Hmm.
Yeah, the more lives you don't get to live, because we all only get to live one life, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so I think that there's that piece, which I think makes it feel increasingly fraught, because it's not like, I don't know, in medieval Europe, you either got married and had kids, or you became a nun, or you helped your sister raise her kids, as and like those were the options, right?
Hmm.
And now we do really have a lot of options. And I know for myself, I'm someone who can't decide what I want to eat for lunch. If I have like four options, I'll stand there paralyzed in the kitchen snacking, right? And so there is, I do think that is sort of increasing the sense of it being complicated and hard, because what life do you want to live? There's sort of a large number. And that is both a wonderful thing about the modern world, and also, I don't know, something that gives me a lot of anxiety, I think,
Hmm.
of picking the right path, because there are so many. Um, but I also think that some of the elements that you brought up are so true. I mean, um, the lack of community support, and how different that looks from the past. We can talk about the history, I think, in a bit, but one of the things that was so striking about my experience at West Point on a military base, watching these Army families, is was that piece of you know real material everyday support for
Hmm.
people in their parenting.
Hmm.
I overheard a conversation between one mother who had it was her first child, young, 3-month old, I think, who was had digestive issues and was just crying all the time. And the other mom had like 4 kids and was sort of had seen it all. And she was like, come over anytime. We literally have a coffee
Yeah.
pot on 24 hours a day. The door is never locked. Like, if you need someone at 2 a.m, come to my house.
Hmm.
And I was thinking, I have one friend in the world, or two friends in the world, who do not live on my block, who I could show up at 2 a.m, and they wouldn't be like, what on
That's
earth
right.
are you doing?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and these were women who had barely knew each other. They lived on the block from each other. And I think that was a piece that made me think, it is about policies. It is about,
Hmm.
sort of institutions that support families, but it is also that sort of intangible human connection that would have been more common in the past, and that modern life has just sort of, I don't know, we've lost it.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think sometimes I'll say this, one of the things that there's a, I think, disservice that's done when people will say like, well, there's systemic issues for this topic or other topics.
Mhm.
Some people will have a kind of negative response to that initially. But I think if you sit down with somebody and you say, well, let's explain the impact of this and see, like,
Mhm.
you almost can't unsee that. Like, there's
Yeah.
obviously an impact. And I mean, one of the biggest things, whether you want to do the social contract thing or not, is that, we don't live on islands, right? We all live together in
Mhm.
communities, in a
Yeah.
shared space, in cities and towns, and whatever. And yet we don't have this kind of, we don't have these structures, and we also don't have that organically happens. So it's like,
Mhm.
people, if you look at our long evolutionary history as humans on the planet, we've always, I mean, we're deeply social. We've always had people helping other people
Yeah.
to do. That's how we survive, this cooperative model. And of course, there's systems that can kind of exploit that in a really negative way, where you don't have
Mhm.
any choice. Like, so there's obviously extremes on that, but I don't think we're anywhere near that. So it's just, I think you see how important it is. But to be fair to your first point, what you were saying, this idea of choice, especially for millennials, I feel it's like for everybody, but for millennials, it's just a lot of angst. It's like, oh my God, what's the
Yeah.
right decision? What do I do? And there isn't a right decision, but that's very, very difficult for a lot of people to be like, when and how, and and it's very hard for people to kind of just be like, there isn't one, and it's wanting to make the
Yeah.
right decision and be responsible, which is great, but sometimes people get paralyzed with like fear of like which choice to make. And this isn't just a choice of like which car do I buy. This is like another human being coming into existence or whatever. And I think
Right.
people really,
Yeah.
thankfully, see how important that is, emotionally, mentally, psychologically, and then yes, economically and physically. So, it's not just, 3 meals a day, roof over your head, clothes on your back. Well, I think we all get now that's important, but there's all these other things. And I think that's what makes people a little bit more, oof, yeah, this is a lot. So I think that's a good thing, but it does
Yeah.
create this idea of choice with more anxiety, which I definitely am sympathetic to. I mean, I hear that a lot.
Totally. And I think you're absolutely right that there's a sense of, I don't know, decision paralysis, or just sort of
Hmm.
trying to figure out like what is the right way to live my life, because I have a variety of choices, or maybe I feel like my choices are actually constrained and the ones that are available to me aren't actually that great, or I might want to have kids, but my life has never provided me the opportunity to do so, and that is fraught. And I see that in my students even more intensively. So I teach college students. I teach Gen Z, and they, they were children in 2008 in the crash. Like they've sort of grown up in a post crash world, and I think many of them saw their families' financial situations change really radically when they were in grade school or whatever, and they almost have this even greater sense than I think millennials do of that they can't make a mistake, like that they have
Hmm.
to get everything right,
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
if I mean, I've had students, who get an A- or a B+ on a paper, and they come to me and they're like, I'm not going to be able to be a doctor now because like I screwed up this paper. And it's like, no, I want to tell them like, no, just calm down. Like life is more forgiving than that. But I do think that there are a lot of the things that millennials have sort of experienced about,
Hmm.
feeling like we need to be more financially secure than our parents might have before we're going to have a child, because we have less trust that the future is going to be
Hmm.
better economically, environmentally, politically, whatever. That Gen Z is sort of even more like another step,
Hmm.
um, less certain that things are going to work out for them.
Yeah, I mean, well, the erosion of trust in institutions, some of it's fair,
Yeah,
but I think a lot of it is really damaging to our society. Because, I mean, in my view, if you're trying to corral 330 million people in a big country, you need some kind of institutional something. But again,
yeah.
institutions that are kind of working for everybody. So yeah, that's
Mhm.
that's definitely difficult. So okay, so let's get into some of the history here. So I can't remember if you start here or not. Did you talk about prior to 1820, so the mid or early 19th century? There were I didn't know this. So, I mean, again, this is why I love talking to historians of different types. You guys are always educating me. There were no laws restricting abortion anywhere in the U.S. I had no idea. This was astounding. Again, current climate. Again, I was born
Yeah.
into a United States where abortion was legal, so it's not now, at least, or not in the same way. So,
Right.
um, why was there no laws restricting abortion? Prior to 1820, and how did it look different? I guess in the
Yeah.
18th century. Um, yeah, it just tells that, and then we'll get to Connecticut, which was the first state to outlaw it in 1821.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, there were colonists to North America brought with them sort of centuries of precedent in Europe, where sometimes there were laws on the books restricting abortion, sometimes there were not. But in general, it was sort of viewed as a woman's thing that she's just going to sort of deal with. The historian Sarah McDougall, who's at, I believe she's at CUNY in New York, she's shown through her work on medieval France that even in places that did have laws about abortion and infanticide, that was rarely prosecuted. That and women who were sort of caught, causing a miscarriage or even committing infanticide were treated very sympathetically in courts of law. This is all the more true in the early part of pregnancy, right? Like, I mean, think about it. Before there's blood tests or urine tests you buy at the drugstore or ultrasounds, in the first, say, trimester, the only person who's going to know that she's pregnant is probably the woman, and maybe her husband or sexual partner if he's really paying attention to her periods. So probably the first, 15 weeks, it would be something that she might notice and then could sort of take care of quietly. And this was really, really common. And we can see this through birth records in early modern Europe, where people slowly start to expand the number of years between siblings. Mm. I mean, they're doing something to limit births. And barrier methods didn't work that well. It was much easier through herbal methods to end a pregnancy once it had started than to sort of prevent a pregnancy in an era before there are condoms or diaphragms or IUDs or whatever. Mm-hmm. So in the sort of in medieval Europe, in early modern Europe, in the American colonies, in the early America, they would have known of lots of herbs and plants that could end a pregnancy at least some of the time. And women used them. I mean, and they didn't really think about it as abortion. They talked about them as female regulating pills or female regulating substances. They said that they were things that would restore menstruation. The idea being, your period is irregular, it's gone away. You drink this tea and then you've restored menstruation and now you can go about your life. So in the 19th century, you asked about sort of there's this period in the 19th century, starting in 1821 in Connecticut, and then by 1880, it's illegal in every state.
Yeah, that's 60 years. Period of crazy.
Yeah, like very fast change from this being sort of like a woman's thing that we just don't really talk about to it being a felony in every state. And by the late 1870s, it is against federal law, like not just state law. So there's this whole soup of factors. One factor is a sort of increasing fear of or desire to control female sexuality. You have a move towards urbanization in the 19th century. People are moving to cities. This creates a situation where there are young unmarried women living outside of their families' homes in large numbers because they're working in mills or in factories or as servants. And so there's just like generalized anxiety about, what's going to happen to their sexuality. In the 1840s in New York, there's a trial of an abortion provider who by that point, it had become illegal in New York. And so she was on trial for having performed an abortion. But one journalist put it in the paper that was not her real crime. Her real crime was showing your wife that she could commit adulteries all day and get away with it. So there's this sort of increased fear of female sexuality, the idea that pregnancy is a thing that controls female sexuality because they can't hide the fact that they've been out there having sex. Mm-hmm. So that's one piece. Mm-hmm. Another piece is, I would say, like more well-meaning efforts to protect women who are living maybe outside of their family's homes, unmarried, and experimenting with sex and experimenting with herbal methods of controlling, ending pregnancies. Sometimes these are very dangerous substances that they are being sold. So some of the first laws regulating abortion, like for example, the one in Illinois, the first law in Illinois was classified under statutes against poisoning. So it was an effort to say, like, people are out there selling really dangerous substances that could end a pregnancy, but also kill the person who is carrying the pregnancy. So there's that piece as well. And then the third factor is that you have in the 19th century sort of the increasing professionalization of medicine as a field, and doctors see alternative practitioners like abortion providers and like midwives as competition. And so there's sort of a concerted effort across the 19th century to make, these alternative practitioners seem dirty, dangerous, untrained. When the American Medical Association is established in, I think it was 1847, they sort of get in on this, and they're pushing for, make these people who are sort of operating with herbal methods illegal. And midwives get caught up in this too. That's a whole other story. But that's sort of, it's trying to capture a market, right? It's trying to control a market. So there's sort of all of these things going on in the 19th century, and it rapidly means that ending pregnancies becomes not just sort of the business of the woman who's doing it quietly, but there are all kinds of stakeholders who are sort of feeling like they want to control it.
That all makes sense. I guess a few questions I have here is, a felony? I mean, that's serious. I mean, so, did it have to be, in terms of the jurisprudence, like a felony? Like, that seems very serious, to kind of penalize someone. And then also, was there any type of like, again, I'm trying to remember the 19th century, which is, it's still kind of puritanical in roots. There's a lot of religious overtures. Was there any element of this playing into the, yes, there's the capitalist economic side of things, which totally makes sense. And then, but again, is there any kind of religious thing as well, where there's this trying to say, well, there's some moral ineptitude if you're doing these things, or it says something about you if you're out, being sexually active with, people that aren't, just kind of one person. And like, was there any of that kind of stuff at this time, or was it just purely on the kind of, economic side of things?
No, absolutely. You're spot on. So the figure who sort of encapsulates this the best is a guy named Anthony Comstock, who has been sort of in the news again lately because a law that was passed in his name was sort of referenced in the Mifepristone ruling from Texas a couple of weeks ago. But so Anthony Comstock, he fought in the Union Army during the Civil War, and he gets out of the Army, and he is scandalized by what he sees as the vice of his fellow soldiers, that they're into pornography and playing cards and drinking alcohol and rude jokes, and they're visiting sex workers. And so he comes out of the Army sort of radicalized, and he becomes one of the late 19th century and early 20th century sort of primary anti-vice crusaders. And for him, it very much is a religious mission. He genuinely believes that sex outside of marriage is something that is going to bring down civilization. Like he thinks that it is it goes against the laws of God, that God sort of put the barrier of pregnancy in place to control people's sexuality. And if you separate sex and pregnancy, like, you're actually going against the laws of God, the laws of nature. You're sort of, he talks about like bringing on the plagues, we're going to end civilization. And so if that's your framework, like if that's what you believe, then it justifies any level of punishment for people who are sort of, either providing abortions or receiving abortions or taking contraceptive pills or things like that. I mean, if it is something that is that dangerous, you asked about, why is it a felony? Why is it that big of a deal? From Comstock's perspective, like, it wasn't just, an individual crime. Like, it really had implications for the future of American civilization, or Western civilization even. And so for him, I mean, he would brag about how many how many people who had violated his laws would, had committed suicide or were sent to work camps, because he really thought that their crime was that great. So Comstock, I mentioned, from the Mifepristone ruling. So in the 1870s, at this point, he has become a very prominent figure in the anti-vice world. He's funded by lots of last names that the Rockefellers. And he ends up going to Congress and proposing a law that makes it against federal law to send anything through the mail that could inspire lewd thoughts. And so this includes everything from child pornography to even initially like medical textbooks, because they have naked people in them, to condoms, to the female regulating pills, like abortion causing substances. It passes very quickly because to him, there's no difference between child pornography and condoms. And once you've rolled them all together, it becomes very hard for Congress to say, no, actually, I think we should be able to send child pornography through the mail. So this passes incredibly quickly. And in 1873, it's become dubbed the Comstock Act. It becomes federal law that you can't distribute these things through the mail. And this is a way that a lot of abortion providers who are operating, outside of state laws end up getting charged with federal crimes, because they're receiving things, to give to their patients. They're receiving them through the mail.
I guess, look, I mean, if Comstock wants to have his opinions or whatever, that's fine. I guess the real, I mean, I have my personal opinion. I think it's absolutely, Looney Tunes. But I guess the point is, or I guess the real scandal here, if you will, is having religious ideas tethered to a legal kind of construct at any point in history where you're unanimously making decisions for a whole group of people. Namely, you have a bunch of white dudes making decisions for women. Like, that's just like, now, to be fair, I think that there is, look, I mean, I think if there are some, I'm trying to, again, at the time, if there are some health or medical concerns about some of these things, yes, I mean, I think that there probably should be some, regulatory things to make sure people are getting good care. But it does seem that a lot of this stuff was really animated by, kind of religious ideology or some kind of extreme version of it. But the point is that had enough legs to get all the way to the U.S. Congress. 73 was the Hayes administration, so I think it was the Republican administration, if I got that right. And that was, obviously a different time. This is still Reconstruction era, so it's just interesting how there was, I guess, an appetite for that in Congress to do that, and and then it's a felony in 1880. Now, I guess that. Well, maybe not so obvious, but I'll link it here and you can tell me if I'm wrong. But I think we see in the United States, I could be really off on my history here, but I know in the late 1870s, and definitely ramps up in the 1880s going into the turn of the 20th century, is when we have the women's rights movement that gets started. Now, I don't know. I mean, I obviously have zero expertise in this, but I, just casually, I mean, I'm sure people can document women's rights movements for many, 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 many years. But I guess in the modern sense of what we get to 1920, the amendment and things like that, some people do kind of put this around 1870s, 1880s, or is it a little bit before that in terms of like an actual movement with the things we know about?
Yeah.
So my only question with that is whether you put the starting point, was a lot of that movement, women's rights movement, kind of first wave feminism, if you will, really animated by these types of things, these types of rulings. Obviously, there are many other things, including the right to vote and et cetera. But how much was there some correlation there, or am I making something that's not true?
I mean, anti-abortion activists will love to point out that Susan B. Anthony was very vocal about being sort of opposed to contraception and opposed to abortion. That some of the that sort of first wave feminism or suffrage movement era feminism was also deeply embedded in the sort of anti-vice and temperance movement, and so. And I also think that there was sort of a political benefit in saying what we are asking for is political rights. We are not saying like, let's go have sex without consequences. Like there's sort of a respectability part of it, but I think also it's sort of like deeply embedded within a religious framework of saying, we want to be partners to our husbands. We want participation in sort of the civic, in the civic environment that we live in, but we are not asking. In fact, we're against the idea of sort of undermining traditional marriage or sort of changing things about the family. So I think that the connection is tenuous there.
In terms of there was a different priority at that time, right? In terms of equality, standing, in terms of, voting politically, et cetera. So less about, I don't want to say social things, but less about this kind of topic that comes later in history, more of like, okay, do we just have like equal rights that like other humans do? Can we do many things in society? It sounds like that was the main focus and priority at that moment. Not to say that people didn't, obviously have opinions or things like this, but knowing that you can't, I think politically and realistically, you can't change everything all in like, one time. Whether they should or shouldn't is another question, but that this seems to be like, let's just be able to vote first. Let's get that first, and then we can, then we can keep working on all these other things. Is kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah. So contraception then becomes legal in 1965, is that right? And then abortion became legal in 1972. It's not anymore federally. And so I guess, just kind of walk us through, I guess, in the 20th century leading up to contraceptives. And then you can talk about Roe v. Wade. I mean, my understanding is, from people I've talked to legally, Roe v. Wade as a legal opinion is not the strongest, if people are very honest. That doesn't invalidate the fact that abortion should be legal. It's just that actual ruling was just not the strongest legal argument. And so I think, again, my understanding is that, coupled with certain political parties being super lazy for 50 years and not ratifying it, is also a problem.
To be left unnamed.
To be left unnamed, more on my side of the aisle, but very frustratingly so. So I guess, how did we get finally to contraceptives, and then legal abortion, and then you can kind of give a kind of fast forward to kind of where we're at now, of how that has shifted and other ways in which we're trying to, fix a crooked line, if you will, at the moment.
Sure. Yeah. So the hormonal birth control pill is invented in the 1950s by a Chicago-based pharmaceutical company called J.D. Searle. And they apply for FDA approval of their drug in 1959. They do not say in their application that this is a birth control pill. They say that this is to treat menstrual disorders like people with irregular periods or amenorrhea. The FDA takes a while to approve it in part because one of the side effects that the pharmaceutical company has to disclose to the FDA is, oh, wait, it also prevents ovulation. And so the FDA finally, when they get around to approving it in May of 1960, they approve it, and they tell the pharmaceutical company Cyril that it is approved, but bottles of it need to carry a sticker label that says in large letters, this product prevents pregnancy. And JD Cyril, one of the executives of the pharmaceutical company, has since said, it was like a free ad. Like they did all of the work for us because, and so by the end of the 1960s, but when it is approved, we are still talking about a world where the Comstock laws have not been repealed. Things that prevent pregnancy are still technically against federal law for, can't be distributed according to federal law. There isn't sort of a federally recognized right for people to access birth control. So lots of doctors start prescribing it for off-label purposes, precisely for birth control. But in 1965, there is a Supreme Court case, Griswold v. Connecticut, where basically the right of married couples to access contraception is granted, but only married couples. So in 1965, married women can get prescriptions for the pill for the purposes of birth control. But say an unmarried woman, a college woman, states can still prevent her from getting that. So it's only in 1972, in the case, oh gosh, I'm forgetting. But basically, there's a Massachusetts case where a birth control activist sort of stages this stunt where he hands contraception to a college-age woman at Boston University. And he gets arrested, and he takes it all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court decides, like, this is sort of a ridiculous standard, that it is, the moment you get married, suddenly you can have a birth control prescription. So in 1972, it becomes legal for all American women to access contraception, and then, as you said, in 1973, and it is in these contraception rulings in 1965 and 1972 that the legal framework for abortion is established. That basically it's under the right to privacy, saying there is nothing more private than like the intimate decisions of whether or not to have a child. That should be between a woman, her doctor, and her partner, and like the state should not be involved in that. In 1970, in the case Roe v. Wade, when it is argued in front of the Supreme Court, one of the justices actually makes a joke that the attorneys who are arguing for the right to abortion are they're making an argument based on every judicial principle that they can come up with, that they're saying, this is the right to privacy. The stronger argument, or what people who were sort of advocating for abortion access were hoping would be the ultimate legal justification for abortion, would be under the 14th Amendment, just sort of equal rights, equal protection. The Supreme Court does not go that way. They go the right to privacy route, which basically says, a woman has the right to, with her doctor, have a private conversation about her reproduction. And so abortion is protected in the sense of that it is that private conversation. This was sort of greeted as a relatively weak legal argument, as you said. And then we spent 50 years with that relatively weak legal precedent and not strengthening it, not ratifying it. So it was a little bit of a disappointment for pro-choice activists and thinkers in 1973 that was the legal reasoning. It seemed shaky then, and I think we've seen how shaky that is. It would be much harder to undercut the right to abortion if it had been established as something that was guaranteed on the basis of sort of equal rights in front of the Constitution. You couldn't have laws that say, well, yeah, it's a private thing between you and your doctor, but your doctor needs to have all of these different kinds of qualifications. They need admitting privileges. They need hallways that are certain width. All of the ways in which states have tried to chip away. Well, prior to Dobbs, tried to chip away at that right to privacy between you and your doctor.
So, I mean, obviously, there's the poor legal standing. Again, it's relevant, but I don't think it invalidates the point that I think obviously abortion should be legal. I mean, I'm not a legal expert, but I mean, I think it is one of those things where if you've had for 50 plus years or whatever it is, women have been getting abortions and things like that. I mean, obviously, socially, it should be legal for a variety of reasons. So I guess where do you think? You can give your personal opinion if you feel comfortable on Dobbs, but and then there's, as you were saying, certain groups that have been trying to chip away at this for a long time for their own, ideological stances and positions. But I guess in terms of a historical lens about that, it seems regressive. It seems backwards. And I'm not saying that because I'm very pro choice. I mean, and so that's what I'm asking, like in a historical context. Obviously, we have many periods in time where we'll, go 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, that happens. But this feels regressive in some ways. I mean, just historically, how do you see it in this whole kind of arc that we've been discussing? And then, your personal opinions, if you want to share.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the things that strikes me is looking historically at the history of people limiting births and ending pregnancies, is that we talked about that over the course of the 19th century, you have one state after another, and then at the federal level, abortion become illegal. At the same time, from all of the available evidence, the demand for abortion goes, it skyrockets. One historian has suggested that, and of course you can only estimate this, right? People are not like recording their abortions. But one historian has suggested that at the beginning of the 19th century, about 1 in 25 pregnancies in the United States was aborted. And by the end of the 19th century, it's it's 1 out of every 4 or 5. And so just like a dramatic increase in the same period when it is becoming increasingly illegal. So I think that there is this feeling in some corners of American politics today that if you make it illegal, that people will sort of magically stop wanting to control their reproduction. And just historically speaking, the evidence is entirely to the contrary. What it does is it gets more dangerous, legally, certainly, but also it gets more dangerous physically. You mentioned earlier, it probably is a good idea that people aren't selling poisons to each other. Like some regulation is a good thing, but you can only regulate something that is legal. Once it is illegal, then people are sort of buying whatever, and there's sort of no control. So you can, one of the major outcomes of Roe was that the number of deaths from sepsis after abortion goes through the floor, because abortions could be, and in fact had to be performed by medical doctors in medical settings. So people are not getting massive infections and dying after abortion. To me, just the history suggests that this fantasy that by making abortion illegal, you'll make it go away, just doesn't track at all. People have shown that they are very motivated to end a pregnancy that they do not want to carry, and that they will take great risk to end that pregnancy. So that's one piece of it. It just seems like a historical fallacy. Also, in terms of it being regressive, I think it certainly came as a surprise to me, and it seems to have come as a surprise to people who are much more familiar with the legal history on this. Like Mary Ziegler is sort of the the foremost expert on the history of reproductive law and abortion law. It seems to have come as a bit of a surprise to her, too, how quickly Comstock has sort of resurrected himself. I mean, even in the book, I make a comment that has not aged well. My book came out last week, but I make a comment about how, like, the last vestige of Anthony Comstock is finally swept away in 1972 when all people get the right to receive contraception. The thing is, the Comstock Law was never repealed. And it wasn't repealed, I think, because on both sides of the aisle, it seemed so old-fashioned. But like, there's not even a point in repealing it because it's so ridiculous. We would never enforce a 19th century law that was that weird and draconian and backwards. Well, surprise. I mean, I did a control F in Judge Kaczmarek's, the Texas judge from Amarillo, who ruled that the FDA authorization of mifepristone, that the abortion pill, should be revoked or was never valid in the first place. If you control F that opinion, he uses the word Comstock 29 times. And he cites it not as like there's this weird old-fashioned law. He cites it as like, this law has been on the books for 150 years. It's established precedent. Like this, sending mifepristone through the mail is clearly in violation of this law. And the thing is, he's not wrong. Like that law was never repealed. But I mean, Democrats, I think, had they repealed it, it would have felt like sort of almost like a weirdly symbolic thing. Like it wasn't even worth doing. And yet now we've found ourselves with judges who are citing it as just sort of like unquestioned legal precedent. So in like a very literal sense, we have regressed, I think.
Yeah, I mean that stuff is bonkers to me. I mean, and the absolute laziness of Democrats is absolutely frustrates me to no end on a lot of things. It's this issue, it's voting rights, it's the equal rights. It's all of this stuff, and it's just like, you've had in the past 20 years 12 of those in power, and or 23 years, 12 of those in power. That's a good portion. You should be, and granted, I mean, it was a different time in 09 and 10, but a lot of things, but you had a super majority. I mean, those things you could have just sailed through, no problem, and no one's going to really care, because it is antiquated and whatever. But if just in case something happens down the road, you'd be like, oh, I'm sure glad we just, got that through, 1/11th hour and on a whole big roll of passage or whatever. It's just, and the fact that we're doing that is really frustrating. It's very, very frustrating. And, people do it after the fact, but it's publicly, it doesn't feel great. And then, politically, then these things, become literally a mountain out of a molehill. Now it's like a big thing. And then, you have Republicans or the other side, just blasting all the time about all these things. And it's like, it didn't have to be any of that if all these things have been done previously. But I mean, it is one of those things where it's like, and it's not like it's the first time, right? We have, we don't have a long history, but we have 250 years. And there are periods where we've seen this happen, and we just still keep making the same mistakes, I think, which is what makes it all the more frustrating. It's not like this is the first time. So, I mean, I think
agree.
That's what's really, most frustrating. So all of these issues in terms of, contraception and abortion are going to be things we continue to discuss and talk about. And, I think we're, again, like I said, trying to fix a crooked line in a lot of ways. So, we'll see how that goes. So a little bit different. So just as a reminder for listeners, all of this is, we're talking about the choice or whatever, or of women not having children. So this is one lane here. But you give in the book a history of the nuclear family. And I thought this was interesting, and how this begins in the beginning of the 19th century, and this concept of the nuclear family, and how that, I'll say, you tell me, but obviously that was pretty prevalent in the 50s and the 60s and even in the 80s and 90s. And, And still, I guess it's the quote unquote standard model of family that we are given, which is, I'm not going to make necessarily a value judgment. I think it was a model, and I think there's pros and cons like any model of family, but it does seem that we are in a transition point, or we're shifting to what that looks like. And of course, there have been other, if you will, alternative types of families at all those different times. But it seems now that we're starting to say, okay, wait a minute, nuclear family, uh, mom, dad, one or two kids, live in a home, whatever. Maybe it's three or four, or it's just one. But kind of this that's the template. That's the model, I guess, or that's what we're starting as baseline. Kind of give us, I guess, the history of that concept beginning and the evolution of it, and why we're having a kind of um, questioning of, okay, wait, do we still want to do it this way? And this is not all great, but or do we want to find alternative ways? So just chat about that a bit.
Yeah, sure. So the term nuclear family was coined by an anthropologist named Bronislaw Malinowski in 1920 or 1921. And he was thinking about the nucleus of a cell, right? That like there's sort of this contained nucleus. And so he, by nuclear family, he meant, a biological mother and father and their offspring, as sort of a contained unit, like the nucleus of a cell. This, as you said, seems super normal to us. It seems like the way families are. But the sociologist Patricia Hill Collins, I really liked the way she put it. She has pointed out that is not only the most unusual way of creating a family, globally and historically speaking, this is also the most stressful way of parenting. That it is sort of a biological mother and father who are solely responsible for their biological offspring. So, and I would add that it is also, even in the United States and in Western Europe, where sort of the nuclear family, I think, is so normal we don't even see it. It's like the water we swim in. It's a relatively new thing. You really don't have to go that far back in history, in American history, to find families that were sort of constructed more broadly. The historian Helena Wall has made the observation that in colonial America, the family was thought of almost solely in the context of the community. So there is that like biological family unit. They lived in houses that sort of housed biological family units. But she points out they never locked their doors. They were in and out of each other's houses. Women were raising kids together. They were disciplining each other's kids. They were feeding each other's kids. They were, sending kids to go live with their sister or their neighbor, or because they had too many kids on their hands and maybe that family's smaller or wealthier. And that this was just sort of, that it was sort of a more flexible model of who could be counted as a member of the family. So I guess the question is like how does this change occur? So in the 1960s, this economist named John Hasnall is sitting around looking at birth and marriage records from 17th and 18th century Europe, like as one does, and he starts to notice this strange pattern in Northwestern Europe over that period, like the late 17th century into the 18th century, where he sees that prior to that period, Northwest Europe looked a lot like other places in the world, in the sense that when a couple got married, they tended to get married quite young. They would move and live with one of their families in sort of a multi-generational household or community. They would have children quite young, and they would participate economically in whatever the family was already doing. In Northwest Europe, in about the 18th century, he notices this starts to change, that people start to get married much later. They start to move away from their families of origin, that is, not join a multi-generational family unit, and that they have a lot fewer kids. And this makes a ton of sense, because if you have to sort of set up your own economically stable life, you probably can't do that at 18. So the age at marriage starts to rise. And it also means that you don't have grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins and siblings to help you raise your kids. So you're going to probably have fewer kids. It sort of upends the math. This model, demographers have called it the European marriage pattern. This starts to show up in the late 18th century and the early 19th century in the United States. So that sort of more family in the context of the community model that Helena Wall talked about in the colonial period starts to look a lot more like this European marriage pattern, or you could say the nuclear family, that people are sort of starting to live, to pull back, I guess, from their community. By the 1840s, this has been not only become the ideal way of making a family, but rhetorically, at least, it has become like the only way of making a family. So the president of Amherst College was a guy named Herman Humphrey. In 1840, he publishes a book where he talks about the nuclear family, though he doesn't have that term yet, but biological family unit is, he says, it's as inviolable as a law of nature, that basically that is the only way that families have ever been created, which is fascinating because if you go back like 60, 70 years, I mean, you that wasn't really the way people were conceiving of their families. So I think very quickly it becomes not only an ideal, but also like the only acceptable way of having a family. And I think, and then of course, fast forwarding a century, like the post-war period only intensifies. Sorry, post-World War II period, the baby boom only intensifies this idea of the nuclear family as like a deeply American concept. It's sort of conceived of as something that makes the United States and the American way of being in the world superior to the Soviet or communist ways of being in the world, that we have this nuclear family and that encapsulates all of our sort of morals and values. And I think we find ourselves still stuck with this in some ways, because the end result is that the nuclear family, if it is supposed to be a contained family unit that sort of looks out for itself and doesn't seek support from outside, it means that you have only two people fully responsible for raising and as we discussed earlier, paying for the care of their children. And this means that sort of all of the community support that I talked about in the American colonies or in a multi-generational family unit where it is more than two adults who are participating in raising the kids sort of goes away. And that's where I think Colin's observation that it is also the most stressful way of parenting in the world comes in, that it's an incredible responsibility and a lot of pressure on the parents in that family unit to raise children with effectively no help. And to answer your question about why I think people are starting to rethink, I think that pressure has just gotten to a point where people are, parents are struggling. It is very difficult to parent in American society today. And so I think that is starting to make people think, like, is there another way of doing this? Because this is unsustainable.
Yeah. So the thing that as I was listening to you explain all this, it sounds like this is a kind of social birth from the end or middle or end of the Enlightenment period, where there was this focus on reason, but this emphasis on individualism, which individualism is fine. I mean, that's a great thing in many ways, but it's like any other concept or idea. Like they have extremes of that. And I think a type of bloated individualism is not always a good thing, economically, familially, socially, etc.
Yeah.
And it seems, look, I mean, to be charitable, I mean, maybe at the time that made sense, right? Maybe at the time, okay, to try it that way or whatever. But I think that there's I definitely don't think it's, rooted in, the biological way, because it's a very kind of myopic, point of view. Maybe there wasn't a global view. And again, and there are, listen, there are many issues with, if you will, a kind of collective way of doing this as well.
Sure. Yeah.
So there's pros and cons, but I do think a kind of hyper individualism where there's a only emphasis on the nuclear family and not having other types of surrogate community or surrogate extended family or actual extended family and community, as I think you're right. Currently it's just reaching a tipping point. And I feel like the cynicism that happens with a lot of people, I don't know if you see it this way, but people start to say, well, we just don't really need any of that. And I don't think it's that we don't need it. I think for some people they might not need it. That's fine. But I think it's, no, we just have to reform or reimagine how we think about family, or how we think about, children or no children, or, in those types of ways. And I think that's, again, people get, connected to, nostalgia, or they get connected to their values or ideals. And they, as soon as you're, again, changing the, or infringing on the nuclear family, it's like, you're breaking the ninth commandment or something. And it's like, it's just, this isn't tenable. It's not that you want to, not have the nuclear family anymore.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
we can look at collectivist societies and see that there's definitely spaces or places where they're doing things very well. And again, there's cons to that as well, just like anything else. But there's definitely some wonderful aspects of that. What do you think on this point?
Yeah, to me, it seems like in I mentioned Humphrey, the president of Amherst College, sort of articulating that the nuclear family is a thing of nature, that it is not just God, it is nature that has sort of created this as the only way of having a family. The danger of that, I think, is that it means that a family that needs outside support is doing something unnatural,
right,
or they are failing to do this thing that is natural. Like, he even compares it to the laws of gravity. So they are like violating the laws of gravity, and I think we see that. I think we can see that even today, that parents who need additional support, or families that need additional support, it's framed as them failing at sort of fulfilling this natural thing that you're supposed to be able to do naturally, which is to alone care for your children. I think about last month in North Dakota, the state legislature voted to not to sort of increase the number of or not to increase the free lunch program in schools. And you had state legislatures standing up and saying, well, if parents are failing to feed their kids, I don't see how that's our problem. And so I think that is the danger that we run with conceiving of the nuclear family as sort of this natural thing that should be able to care for itself, because it allows us to say, someone or a family that is unable to fully care for itself in the absence of community support, like that's their failure. That's not my problem.
Yeah.
When if you look, even a little bit further back in history, families that needed support, there were places to get support. Like I said, in the American colonies, it was very common for families that fell on hard times. They would send their kids to go live with, people who were wealthier, temporarily or permanently. And that was just sort of done. It wasn't, the failure of the nuclear family unit. So I do think that there's hangovers from the naturalization of the nuclear family. I think that there are lots of ways to make a family. I wouldn't want to demonize any of them, but the problem is not the existence of the nuclear family. It is the sort of expectation that every family should look that way, and every family should be able to survive alone.
Yeah, 100% agree with you. Let me take what you're saying, agree with you, and then make it, a little bit more spicy. So, one of the things that absolutely drives me fucking bonkers with Republicans and folks on the right is this almost, you know, this pornography of the nuclear family as being this like esteemed value. That's fine. But when the problem I have with the right on this and and definitely with libertarians is, well, people need to be able to do it themselves and figure out how to do it themselves. And everyone has this kind of freedom and liberty and all this stuff. And that sounds great. But the problem is that humans can want to do something, but not able to, or they make mistakes. We all make mistakes. We all fail, or I want to do that, but I don't have enough of the willpower, the resources. And so it's one of those things where things break, things go wrong. And in reality, that's, you have to have ways of trying to protect for that, or to, because then it does become other people's problems. So the way this, I think, comes out is, I remember hearing about I've said this before in other conversations, but I mean, I was absolutely astounded at how much people during 2020, schools were closed, but there was people in full PPE gear giving lunch to kids that's the only meal they had. That doesn't mean they have terrible parents. That just means that they might not have means, or they're working 3 jobs or whatever. And that's a harsh reality that should be corrected, and it's a shame. And I do think at the federal level and some state levels, what we've seen is we have to end childhood poverty, right? You saw that with the Inflation Reduction Act here in my state in Maryland. Our governor is working aggressively to end child poverty and hunger and things like that. That's just is not acceptable. I don't think the point is that we want government or all these other types of state or federal programs to be feeding kids and giving them things or whatever. It's sometimes parents just suck. Sometimes they're shit parents. Sometimes they don't have the finances to do it. Sometimes there's all of these things, and you need to have certain safety nets or certain things to help that. You can't just rely on if everyone does it right. So like you were mentioning in the state of North Dakota, like that's a shame if you're going to vote against that because of something. But I don't think something as basic as feeding your kids, I don't think that that's a problem with parents saying, I don't want to do it. I mean, of course, again, if there's obviously abuse or neglect cases, that obviously happens. But I think a lot of people have challenges. So I think instead of trying to fit people into just this, everyone has to fit in this one box, it's, well, how do we have different ways of trying to enhance or amend or adjust the nuclear family where everyone doesn't feel by themselves and they have to use all of these other programs where they have a community or they have extended family or things like that. And if that's not available, or if that's not there, and in their world, you can't get an abortion, so you have a kid, even if there's all these extreme cases, it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, there's like a million holes with all these things. And I can understand, some of the, the ideas behind it. But, I think when you take the whole kind of like gestalt of it and you like wide lens it and you look at that, I mean, those are big, big, big issues. And I think that, I'm not against, in theory, the nuclear family. I think it's preposterous to say that it's the natural way, but I think that I definitely think it needs to modernize. It needs to at least reform. And this is kind of getting to I think more of what your book is saying is, and if people don't want to do that or they opt out of it, that's fine too. I just think we have enough ideas. I mean, isn't that true freedom and liberty for a lot of people? So why are we trying to fit everyone in this kind of same bucket of sorts? I don't understand that. So, I mean, that's my spicier take, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on it. But yeah, that's where I land on it.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I think it also represents a really narrow way of thinking about, my responsibility for the next generation. Like it narrows it solely to like my responsibility is to the people I have biologically produced, rather than thinking sort of more broadly about like, in my community or in my society, I have a responsibility to the next generation. And I also think one thing that my book also talks about is sort of this feeling, I think, in the present that's relatively widespread of a divide between mothers and women without children, that they're sort of like fundamentally different, that their ways of being in the world are totally different.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it can feel, I mentioned that the nuclear family can isolate parents, and in particular mothers who still tend to do more of the housework and the child raising.
Yeah.
It can be a very isolating experience. It can also be a very isolating experience to not have children and feel sort of
Oh,
completely
certainly.
cut off
Certainly.
from any contact or any responsibility for the next generation. And I think if we just thought beyond the nuclear family and sort of broadened our understanding
Mm-hmm.
of
Mm-hmm.
how we care for communities, how we care for the next generation, you can sort of, and you can mitigate both of those feelings of isolation at the same
Mm-hmm.
time by
Mm-hmm.
supporting parents, and then also involving people who are not parents in sort of having a stake in what comes next. I mean, if we just thought sort of beyond this biological unit, I think we could really, like you were saying, reconceive of how we care for children more broadly, or how we care for the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I want to come to that because that's, I think, another big thing I've thought about, and I thought about a lot while reading your book. But I want to get in here. It kind of goes to this extended family, and we see this idea of the grandmother hypothesis, which is super interesting. So I've talked about this twice on the podcast at some length. So I have a friend of mine, Nicola Rehani. She wrote this book, The Social oh God, I'm blanking on the name, social instinct, and it's all about her work on cooperation. She's fantastic. She's great, and she mentions it in that book. And we talk about it a little bit in that conversation. And then I had a historian on the podcast, Susan Mattern. She wrote the book The Slow Moon Rises. I think I might have butchered that title too. Anyways, and that's a book on the history of menopause, which was, I've read it 3 times actually. It's a
I will
deeply,
have to find that. I haven't read it. It
it's a
sounds fascinating.
wonderful book. It is a wonderful book. It is, I really enjoyed it. I actually read it years ago when it came out, just kind of like a random, bookstore book that caught my eye, and that's that is not going to be my experience. So I was curious about,
Yeah.
well, I want something I'm never going to experience. What is that? I'm curious all about it. I want to know about it. And I thought it was a great book. It's divided into 4 parts, and in the fourth part, it's interesting. She talks about how menopause could be a Western cultural syndrome, much as there are cultural syndromes in other parts of the world, which I thought was really, really interesting. Um,
Fascinating.
yeah, it's really fascinating, and she gives a great history of it, and history, and some obviously some of the biology there. Great book, highly recommended. And she was very nice enough to come on, and we talked for about 2 hours. She doesn't do a lot of interviews, so I felt really honored. And she was very sweet and super brilliant, and we had a fantastic conversation. And we spent a good amount of time on the grandmother hypothesis. She talks about it in her book. There's a very long chapter in there on that. We spent probably a good 30 or 45 minutes on it. And so you bring it up in your book as well. So I'm curious about, kind of from your perspective, and this is will dovetail into the bit you were just talking about on um, how people that are, so this is on the other side of things. So you could say ostensibly that, obviously that people that are uh, not childbearing age, I think is the right way to say it. People that are older and they're in their, past menopause, and they're, grandmother age, or they are grandmothers themselves, how they're still, from an evolutionary perspective, Susan talks about this in her book, and compares it with other primates. You know, humans still keep living, right? Even though they have no reproductive purpose, quote unquote,
Yeah.
they still keep living. And the idea is how they're contributing in, uh, with various pair bonds of other folks, and helping raising children and being a part of the family, extended and all that. So how do you kind of think about the grandmother hypothesis and this idea of women that are not having children anymore, but how they're still super essential and necessary for folks that are, or for families in general.
Yeah, I mean, I was really taken with the grandmother hypothesis, and I mean, I think you did a great summary, but very briefly, it's this idea that the very few mammals live for very long after menopause. And other primates, they die shortly after their last birth. It's like humans and then 4 species of whales that live for a significant amount of time after menopause.
And
So the
maybe
question is why?
elephants also are.
Yeah,
They
you're
live
right.
pretty long as well, somewhere in there. Yeah, it's something like that. But like primates, they live to like 40, and then they don't live much longer after that.
Right. Yeah. They have their last baby and then they die. And so the grandmother hypothesis is in part, I mean, it's like we are bipeds with large brain cases. So that means that creates a problem in birth, because we have to be born very small. Like our hips are small because we stand. But our heads are very big. So we kind of get born half baked. Like we're not, we think about other mammals, like a lamb is standing within 20 minutes of being born, and a puppy is like biting you and eating food at 4 weeks old. And humans take years to be even moderately self-sufficient. And so where the grandmothers come in, that basically the grandmother hypothesis is that a woman, an older woman, becomes more useful to the survival of her community or her species by helping care for the offspring of others than she would be by continuing to create more offspring. Anthropologists have found that in some indigenous societies that are sort of hunter-gatherer lifestyles, the children of a woman whose mother has died are much less likely to thrive. They're more likely to die because they don't have a grandmother sort of participating in their care. I took this. What I took from the grandmother hypothesis was, I mean, not solely limited to the utility of biological grandmother, but it's just sort of further evidence that it takes more than the biological parents to help children thrive. That in humans, because of the complexity of raising a human, because we are so helpless for so long, and I think I would add, I mean, this isn't evolutionary, but in the world we live in, where there are so many pressures on everyone, that it is just sort of, it is necessary not only for the experience of the parent, to have support, but that actually it helps the children thrive as well. That having more adults involved in their care is a good thing for children as well.
Yeah, I think it's good for a lot of things, and I think also for cognitive development, for social development. I mean, it's tremendous with same aged peers, but then also for interacting with folks that are older from another generation. So I totally agree. So I guess the question I have here is what we were talking about before this, is that I guess how for people, I have some friends that have said that, look, I'm not going to have kids. Like it's just for any of the reasons we listed earlier, right? And I think some of them really have. It's just a kind of volitional thing. I think they could probably do it financially. They have, good family, that 5% or whatever it is. I guess my question on that is the fundamental question that I have is how do we trying to formulate it? How do we give, like, we don't see, let's say, women, or you can put men, or just people that aren't choosing not to have children, as like less adults, or they haven't grown up, right? Or because they don't have kids, or like not that we make them second class citizens, that's too strong, but that it's a little bit less than, right? And kind of connect it with this idea of, well, you're not a parent, so you can't have an opinion on children, right? And to me, that that drives me nuts, right? I tell this to students when I teach, and when when you're a student, you're learning to be a clinician, a psychologist or therapist, what have you. You have to, usually somewhere in your 20s, usually, and kind of traditionally, and a lot of folks that are in training, they don't have kids, and so they'll sometimes do couples work or they'll do family work. And, at some point, whether it's in, supervision or in didactics or something, they'll say like, they'll bring this up. You know, the client is saying, all these things about them as parents or in their let's say, in their marriage, but as parents or in the family. And I'm not even like, I'm not even dating anybody and I don't have kids. And like, I feel so like, that imposter syndrome thing is just like, going full force right now. What do I say? And usually it is something, I discuss with students or supervisees, and I say, well, number one, it's not your personal opinions or things like that in that setting. But however, I think each perspective has value, tremendous value. And I do not think that people need to have, because the thing that's always going to happen is, even if you have children, it's always going to be how you parent, but that's not how I do it, right? Or that's not how you do it. So it's, you might get some, pearls of wisdom, if you will. But at the end of the day, it's going to be, yeah, that doesn't work for me. Or you don't know my kid, or that's not how I was raised, or that's not how I parent. And so it really isn't like what advice are parents giving to each other. I guess nominally that's, that happens. But I'm saying that because so many times people that don't have children or have no intention of having children, it's almost like they're invalidated from an opinion. And I don't think their opinion has more or less value than someone that does have children, because each experience is different. Okay, that's fine. I have that viewpoint. Okay. But I think as a society, implicitly or explicitly, that definitely happen. I've seen that happen. Right. And sometimes the person that doesn't have children will out themselves. Like, I'm not a parent. I don't have kids, so I don't really know. But here, and it's like, don't do that. You don't have to caveat it. Like, that's fine. Like, it's still going to be somebody's experience. So, anyways, how do we move our society in the 21st century where we're going to have, it's okay to not have children. That's fine. That's not a taboo. And that people that don't aren't invalidated from having an opinion about children. What do you think about this?
I end the book with sort of trying to think through how we as a society could broaden the definition of family and sort of involve more people in our lives. And I suggest that there's some piece of the work is on people without children like myself, to sort of challenge us to show up for the people in our lives who do have children, and show up in like real, consistent, material, time-intensive ways. I think there is a second piece of that, which is that it requires parents to let go of a little bit of control and be like, yeah, that's not how I would hold my kid, but you also don't hold a kid all day, every day, and it is safe. So like, carry on, that there has to be some sort of letting go of control and letting people in, and recognizing, as you say, that just because a person doesn't have children of their own doesn't mean that they don't know how to interact with kids or might not be helpful in material, granular ways. But that said, we it's hard. We don't have a framework because the nuclear family has been so sort of naturalized for us. We don't really have a framework for how people beyond maybe aunts and uncles are supposed to participate in the daily lives of parents and people with kids. The theorist Bell Hooks she wrote an essay called Revolutionary Parenting, where she's sort of talking about this idea of how do we expand our ideas of the family. And she has a section in there where she didn't have children. She and her partner wanted to be involved in the lives of the children around them. And she talks about how they tried very hard to do this. They like tried to get their neighbors to let their kids come over and bake cookies with them. And she's like, people think it is so weird that you want to hang out with their kids. Like, we don't
Yeah,
have a
yeah, yeah,
framework for
yeah,
this.
yeah.
And she said that eventually they stopped trying because they didn't want people to think they were super creepy or something.
Right, right.
But I think this is all like symptoms of a world in which the only people who should be responsible for caring for children are the people who biologically created them. And so it's going to require a lot of work, and it's showing up, it's letting people in, but it's also like this broader cultural thing to reconceive of other adults as potential caregivers and participants in your child's life in a way that we don't really have a framework for. We don't really have a word for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's hard. I mean, I guess I don't really have an answer.
It is hard. I mean, I have, again, friends and family that they're just old enough now. They haven't had kids and they're just not going to at this point. But I really get really frustrated and again sad because I see other people, just kind of look down at them because they don't have kids. And it's and I mean, again, I'm saying this as a parent. Like, I think each experience is valuable, and I think each person can have an opinion on kids and parenting, even if you don't have that experience. I don't need to. Again, people are gonna, beat me up for this, but I don't need to shoot heroin in my arm to know what the experience is like, right? Again, I'm not making a comparison between drugs and parenting. I'm just saying that there's you don't need to have every experience to know what it is like, and then the fact of this kind of hierarchy of placing more respect for people that are parents. It's like, well, they're still the way you parent. Again, that's not to invalidate other parents and the wisdom and the knowledge that they gain and things like that. But sometimes people will ask me, they'll if they're becoming parents or whatever, how did you do this, or what did you do? And I'll look, I can tell you specifically what I did, but that's not going to be very helpful for you because my kid's different. What my wife and I did was different. We were at a different time, etc. So I can tell you, but you might say like, oh, I don't know if that will work for me. But I do think what I tend to say is what does your instinct say? What's your intuition say? And what are you worried about? And then kind of generally say, it depends on what your framework or philosophy is of having with your kid or whatever. I think, that's I guess the best non-answer or something, but it's one of those things where it's like, you have to just kind of have a kind of framework of how you want to raise a person to be a functioning, healthy, contributing person in society. I mean, that's kind of your role, physically, emotionally, mentally, physically, all the different components, and so I think you can get that from anybody. You can certainly get that from people that don't have kids. And I don't, again, think one is more valued than the other. I think so, but I think I would assume is the kind of pervasive, because I've seen it very often, kind of heuristic is, I'm going to go ask the person that has a kid because they remember diapers and bottom. I mean, it's like, yeah, sure. But like also kind of what you're saying, and I don't have an answer either, is we also box people out that don't have kids. So it's like, don't. It's very, very possessive. And I just think all parents are narcissists, and not in the worst way, but there's good and bad narcissism. But I think it's just, it's at the end of the day, it's you in there. So it's a part of you. So you have more like stake in it. You have more of like this like possessive kind of like, that's going to, there's a part of me, or that's going to be an impact on me. And I think people just don't want to really mess that up, whatever. But I think I want a society, especially in a, modernizing 21st century, where we can give just as much respect to people that do not have children as people that do have children, and that it's just another type of way of doing things, and that their opinions and their ideas are still equally as valid, if you will. That for me is what is, I think, really, really important. And I think that's sort of kind of at the heart of what you're saying in your book. So I guess the last question I have for you is, what is it that you've written a book that may ruffle some feathers or make some people upset, and I think that's a good thing. Um, but what is the thing that you want people to get, the one or two things, or if people read it and you say, yes, that's exactly what I was trying to say. You got exactly the message I was trying to say. What would those one or two things kind of be for you?
So, for one thing, I was hoping to start a conversation. This is going back to the beginning of our conversation today, about the complexity of reproductive choices. Trying to get people to think beyond, you like children and you want them, so you have them, and you don't like children and you don't want them, so you don't have them. I wanted to start a conversation about, the how complicated it actually is to think about having a child, and how complicated it has always been, and the ways in which the world we live in has made it more complicated. So I guess I wanted to start get people thinking about the gray area, and sort of add nuance to conversations about having children. The other thing I wanted to do, and this wasn't a piece of the book that I was thinking about when I began it, but I was writing the book over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, and looking around me, the people I saw who were struggling the most were parents of young children, and who were sort of cut off from the sort of meager support systems that they have in normal times, and that they were really struggling. And it just sort of, something clicked in my brain when I realized that the reasons it is hard to be a parent are the same reasons that people give when they say they are not going to have children. And so that made it seem far less like a divide, and actually like we're all in this messy situation together, and we're just sort of, our outcomes are on either side of a coin, but we are all sort of responding to the same factors. So it's not so much that we're fundamentally different, it's we're all experiencing the same things, and making the best choices that we can. And that piece links, I think, with a lot of what we were talking about the ways in the past that parents would have been more connected to the community, and they would have been sort of raising children in a community context that included people with children and without children. So I guess one thing I wanted to say is, like, if we look to the past, parents didn't have to do it alone. People without children weren't quite as isolated. So the way we are today, where parents are carrying all the weight and people without children feel, isolated from the project of raising the next generation, it doesn't have to be that way, because we've lived in a different way before.
Yeah, no, I think that's nicely put. It almost feels like a puzzle piece that fits. It's like, well, these people won't feel as isolated, and these people won't feel as overwhelmed. And if you have a good community, then you just help each other out. Like, I mean, it's, whether you want to have this kind of, kind of adoptive aunt kind of thing or whatever, or uncle or things like that, where yes, but they're really, really instrumental. I think that would produce, dividends of sorts for the psychological growth of children and adolescents. And I think there's a lot of positives. I mean, obviously there's some risks there, but like anything else, but I think there's a lot of positives. So I fully agree.
Yeah. I was afraid that the end of the book could feel really Pollyannish, like the conclusion is we just have to care about each other more. But I actually think that that's a really radical suggestion, that we care about each other more. That's not a fluffy thing like that. If we're talking about care as like real material participation in each other's lives, that is a radical concept.
Yeah, because people have to expose themselves to allowing people in, making themselves vulnerable.
Sacrificing things that they have themselves, their time and their money to care for someone else. Yeah.
And I think that is tough. I think that is tough. I think possible, and I think it could be really good. But I think it's, we just have to get there.
Yeah.
Well, the book is called Without Children: The Long History of Not Being a Mother. This is through SEAL, which is Division of Basic and Hatchet Books. It's out everywhere. People can pick it up. Where are the best places for people to find yourself, whether social media, online, or through your institution? Where's the best place?
So you can find my website, which has links to everything, and my email if you want to reach out. It's poheffington.com, or you can find me on Instagram at Peggy O.H. Donnell. See what I did there? Peggy O'Donnell with the H, on Instagram and Twitter. So yeah, you can find me in all of those places, and I'd love to continue the conversation.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I have to say, I was really looking forward to the conversation. I loved your book. I really enjoyed reading it, and I was really excited to talk to you. And it was not a disappointment. I really felt kind of enriched by the conversation. You're very lovely to talk to, and I really like your thinking and all the hard work that you did on the book. And so I think it's just been a really big joy. So I really, really appreciate you coming on and chatting with me.
I have enjoyed this so much. Thank you for your thoughtful questions and conversation.
Yes, of course.